We light this chalice with the embers of compassion. We light this chalice with the torch of justice. We light this chalice with the radiance of joy. I'll bet you've all heard stories about magical creatures who grant wishes. Genies. So, could that be a genie? I meant to bring my magic lantern and I forgot it this morning. There's just too many things going on. Yeah. What are some stories you know about genies or other creatures granting wishes? Do you know any stories? Aladdin's one of them. What happens? You know, usually the wishes come in threes, don't they? I give you 3 wishes. What often happens with the 3 wishes? They get bad wishes. They don't go very well, do they? Yeah, because the ones who get the wishes to come out right usually have to be pretty smart, don't they? And usually the first 2 are just junk. Horrible things happen. Yeah. So, I'm going to tell you a story about a guy who, had 3 wishes of a sort. Only I'm going to call them prayers, because prayers and wishes are kind of similar, aren't they? You guess. Well, I'll tell you they are. They're very similar. You wish good things to happen. You wish good things to happen to yourself. You wish good things to happen to other people. So this is a story about a guy who lives here, right here in Hawaii, in Aiea, by the name of Captain Gerald Coffey. And he was a pilot, a Navy pilot way back in the time of the Vietnam War. But before I tell you that story, I want to tell you another story. So, because today's a very special day. This is a twofer day. What's a twofer? You get 2 for the price of 1. So there is this guy who thought he was very smart. And he was walking around very pleased with himself and how smart he was. And he got so tired from all of this thinking about how smart he was that he decided to lay down and rest. And he rested under a big tree. And this particular tree had fruit on it. And those are walnuts on a tree. You know what a walnut is? It's a fruit. Well, it starts out as a fruit, then it turns into a nut. See how green it is? It's the fruit of the tree. Yeah. And next to him, as he stared out across the field, next to him was a watermelon patch. Now there's a fruit, yeah. And he was looking at the watermelons on this spindly little vine. He was looking at the walnuts up on the big tree, and he was thinking, if I were God, I would do this the right way. Look at this little tiny walnut on this big, strong tree, and look at this giant watermelon on the little vine. That should be the other way around. The big fruit should be on the big, strong tree, and the little nut should be on the vine on the ground. And just when he was having this thought and pleased to himself to no end, guess what happened? A nut fell out of the tree and bonked him on the head. Now, what if one of those fell out of a tree and bonked you on the head? Wouldn't feel good, would it? But there's something fun you can do to entertain your cat, though, with a watermelon. So anyway, so he wasn't as smart as he thought he was the point of that story. So now to Captain Gerald Coffey, and he was flying his jet plane one day in Vietnam, and he got shot down, and the plane exploded. See that little thing off to the side there? Do I have a pointer here? It doesn't work very well. Well, that's the ejection seat. He ejected, and he landed in the water, and had a broken arm, and the enemy, the Viet Cong, came and got him, and they took him to the prison camp, and he was in pain, and they tortured him, and they did all sorts of horrible things to him. And, the story gets a little grim here. So there he is being marched off to the prison camp. And that's what he looks like now. And he started praying. He believed in God, and he started praying. And his first prayer was, God, please, please make this never have happened. Run the film back 5 minutes so I can zig when I should have zagged, or zag when I should have zigged. Well, did that happen? Does that ever happen? No, that never happens. But that's what he prayed anyway. And then days turned into weeks and weeks into months, and he started praying, God, rescue me, get me out of here. Let the cavalry come and take me away. Cavalry, on horsebacks, the bugle call. Da-da-da-da-da. Cavalry come to rescue you. Did that happen? No. Then the months turned into years. He was there, by the way, for 7 years. And everybody was kept isolated, and it was really horrible. And finally he started praying, whatever happens to me, can I use that in some way to become a better person? Do you think that might have happened? That is what happened. Then he started thinking, okay, how can I survive here? How can I... He created a tapping communication where all the other guys could tap and communicate with one another. When he finally got out, he went to Berkeley and got a degree in political science, and now he's one of the top speakers in the country, talking about this experience and what he learned from it, and how he learned that from this prayer, he learned that if you don't do it, then who will? So when things aren't going well for you, instead of making a wish to the genie god to make it all better, think, how can I make this work to my advantage? How can I become a better person from this? And that's the story of Captain Coffee. Captain Coffee, just like, coffee in the morning. Coffee. Drink a cup of coffee. Java Jive. Yes, we're going to sing them out as usual.
Make a bridge. Here we go.
Talking a few weeks ago about the erotic power of prayer, I was suggesting that one definition we may have of prayer is that energy that emanates from one heart to another. It's that act and that mindfulness that connects us on a deep and intricate level. This week, we're going to be talking about a different form of prayer because, in my mind, there's at least two different forms of prayer. Ones that are called petition kind of prayers, that the kind of prayers that you speak out loud for yourself. And there's one called intercessory prayer. And this is one where you're praying for another person. So what has that looked like for me over the years? As I mentioned before, I have many problems when it comes to this whole idea that prayer is closely linked to theodicy, that an all-powerful God has control over the outcome of what happens after you pray. Kind of like the genie that Richard mentioned earlier, right? And so as we could see from that, and as the kids pointed out to us, that usually our wishes end up being bad wishes, that the outcome are not necessarily what we had in mind. And I think about this in terms of who have I prayed for in the past? And I mentioned a friend of mine, Teresa. I was 19 years old when this happened. I was praying for Teresa that for God to somehow cure her of her ovarian cancer. that cancer would disappear and she would somehow miraculously be whole again. Well, needless to say, that never happened. And what did happen, however, was I received a bunch of platitudes and a bunch of theological statements that I don't even believe in, such as Teresa died because it was part of God's plan. Or there's this other one that said, well, maybe God needed another angel in heaven. And I thought to myself, well, if God were powerful, why can't God just create another angel? Why take my angel away from me in order to have another angel in heaven? Because don't we need more angels here on earth than we do in heaven? Come on, we've exceeded the quota of angels in heaven, right? So let's spare some angels down here. And so it made me really, speaking about, keeping your tweets on and your social media on, it made me want to tweet WTF every time I heard these platitudes or there's these silly little sayings about what I'm supposed to believe about intercessory prayer. And so consequently, or here's the other part of intercessory prayer. I don't know how many of you have been the recipient of people saying, I'll pray for you. But oftentimes, these are unsolicited prayers. Let me give you an example. When I was growing up, for example, people wanted to pray the gay away in my life. How many of you have heard that saying? So it's basically these reparative people who think that somehow, if you only have enough faith, if you only prayed hard enough, that God would cure you of your homosexuality. And it made me want to put up a sign outside my door that says, no solicitors allowed, not even if you're here to pray for me. And it almost made me want to just say, no thank you, in front of their faces, because that's not the kind of prayer I need in my life right now. So I don't know how many of you have ever gone through those moments, but for me, it never worked. And I realized these days why it never worked, because they were so outcome-driven. And indeed, I think oftentimes in American society, we want to see results very quickly, and we want to see our goals met, that we view intercessory prayer as an outcome-driven kind of practice. So instead, is there another way to look at intercessory prayer, perhaps, that isn't necessarily outcome-based? So I did some more research and came across this book that was actually given to me this past April. Now, mind you, I'm not necessarily recommending this book because there has to be a lot of interpretation in order for it to fit into a Unitarian Universalist context. But fear not, I have taken the liberty of mining it for the best quotes in the book. All right? So I'm going to share with you one of those quotes. And the idea, this is from a guy by the name of Kenneth Carter Jr. He wrote a book called Pray For Me. And in this book, he talks about the idea that intercessory prayer is about having one person who has a deep sorrow in their life. And that person is like holding a really heavy bucket. So if you can imagine, isn't that often the case in your life when tragedy strikes? That somehow you feel like you're carrying a heavy burden. That this heavy bucket contains the bucket of pain, it contains the bucket of grief, it contains the bucket of sorrow and isolation and hurt. All right? So imagine that person is carrying the bucket. What is the role of the intercessor in that situation? Kenneth says, an intercessor is one who comes alongside that individual with an empty bucket. The person in need gives his or her agenda to the intercessor, and the intercessor receives that agenda as the work of prayer. Intercession is carried out by those with enough space in their lives to include the needs of others, family, friends, congregations, communities, and the world. For me, that was such a powerful imagery of what prayer could look like. And isn't that what our lay ministers do? They're here to say, we have an empty bucket. How can we help you lift your bucket so you wouldn't have to struggle with that grief all by yourself, so that you wouldn't have to carry that load of pain and sadness and disappointment all by yourself. And isn't that what we do in the Book of Life moment? Isn't that a way of bucket sharing in our community? Our way of saying, you are not alone. You don't have to be alone in your joy or in your sorrow, that your grief is my grief, and that your joy and your success is my joy and my success. That we are here to intercede for one another. So as we can see, that's not so much as result-driven or goal-oriented, but it's more about how we are able to live together in community to share our hearts with one another. So Kenneth talks about 3 elements of intercessory prayer. The first element he talks about is that intercessory prayers ought to have a disciplined persistence to it. That somehow we need to come back month after month and week after week and keep in that persistence of interceding for another person. What does he mean by this? The only thing I could think of is an example that I have, being the minister of the Metropolitan Community Church before, where week after week, when we're serving people communion, we would ask them, is there anything you would like us to pray with you for? And people would come up to us with their concerns and with stuff that's weighing heavily in their hearts. And I remember one congregant who would always come up to me and say, yes, please pray for me. I'm suffering from separation anxiety with a relationship, a long-distance relationship that I have. Please pray for me that something would happen. And I thought to myself, well, you know, and pretty soon it became a ritual for us, where every week he would come up and I'd say, let me guess what you want me to pray for you for. Your relationship. Wow, that's a new one. But week after week, we would engage in this act. And I was even surprised to myself that reconciliation didn't necessarily take place for this person. So the result was not necessarily that they got back together, but the result was that he was more willing to let go of himself and let go of the relationship and move on and find somebody new to date eventually and find healing in his life. And so we may not necessarily know what the answer is to that particular prayer, but for me, it was about that persistence of being present with one another and saying, I'm here for you. So the second part to intercessory prayer that Kenneth talks about is being able to experience grace in the moment. Being able to experience grace and being open to grace happening in one's life. I remember back when I was candidating, and I can't believe that it's almost 2 years since I've been the minister of this congregation, but when I was pre-candidating, I was candidating already at that point, right, Veronica? Back in April, I don't know if you remember this story or not, but I was actually a little hesitant to schedule it for that weekend because I had a member of my congregation who is in the active process of dying. And she, just a month ago, before that point, was a very healthy individual, but she got admitted to the hospital because she had a swollen foot. And I was in that room when the doctor came back with the diagnosis that said she's suffering from terminal cancer and that she only had 2 weeks left to live. And so, as you could imagine, her husband was very anxious that what would happen if I left? What if she passed away while I wasn't there? And so I promised her that I would check in with her wherever I was and make sure that she's okay. But before I left, I asked her to do one thing. I said, why don't you come up with a bucket list of what you want to do, during the remainder of your time here on this planet? And she said, well, I always wanted to go to Hawaii. My son-in-law is actually from Hawaii, and I've always wanted to go there. And so I thought that was kind of ironic that here I am in Hawaii where she wanted to be, and yet she couldn't be there. And so how could I intercede on her behalf and pick up her bucket, literally her bucket list, from her bucket, right? So that's kind of interesting too, the play on words, to take with me to Hawaii. And so on the Monday, the Sunday after I preached my first sermon, I actually gave them a call. So I said, Al, how's Mary Pat doing? And he said, not too well. She can't speak anymore, and I don't even know if she recognizes me anymore. And we're thinking that she doesn't have long to live. So she may have a day or two, but that's about it. And so I said, with a heavy heart, I said, well, why don't you put her on the phone anyway? Let me talk to her. So he did, and I remember just praying a very simple intercessory kind of prayer. I just said, Mary Pat, at this point in your life, may you find peace. May you know that you are loved and you are surrounded by people who love you. And may you find the strength within you to let go if you feel that the time is right. And after I hung up on the phone, I somehow knew inside me that that was it. That was the moment for Mary Pat in this world. And sure enough, a few hours later, she transitioned. That for me is a great experience of grace because it assuaged my guilt that I was here without her. And it made me think, just like the blessing that we read to Karen earlier, that we are still part of this interconnected web of life. In fact, the picture that I asked Jonipher to pick for the cover of the order of service and also here on the PowerPoint slide is actually a picture that you get if you Google Indra's net. So Indra's net is the Hindu idea that we're all jewels in the larger web of life. And so how are we connected via prayer, even in the midst of the most difficult aspects of our lives? So the other experience of grace that I just noticed recently took place with my colleague. So I don't know how many of you know this, but I was actually part of the First Parish Project, where we connected with other clergy people who are in their first ministry in their first parish. And I remember being in a group with, I was in a group with a minister by the name of Sarah, who is the conference minister for the United Church of Christ conference, annual conference, or I don't know what they call it. It's basically the district in Florida. And there was an article that came out recently about Sarah that talks about how she handled the verdict that just came out in regards to the Trayvon Martin case. As many of you will recall, that also took place in Florida. So Sarah's response to that as the conference minister was to drive down to the Martins church, which was an African Methodist Episcopal church. And I don't know how many of you have been to an AME worship service, but it's probably nothing like a United Church of Christ service, because the UCC are kind of close to us in that we're accused of being the frozen chosen, right? Whereas African American churches, they're more lively, they sing gospel music, and it's more of a call and response kind of environment. And Sarah, my friend, is white, and obviously AME is an African American tradition. And so Sarah was saying in the article how honored she was to be invited by the pastor of that church to actually do the prayer of the people. And she said that at that moment, she experienced deep and profound grace. Because what must the congregation be going through, grieving the not guilty verdict in this situation? What kind of betrayal and racism must they be experiencing at that point? And so Sarah, instead of coming up with this great elaborate prayer, just stood up there, and the first thing that came out of her mouth is, I don't know what to say. I'm just some young white girl. And yet I'm here with you because I grieve with you, because I'm here to share my bucket with you, because I believe that we struggle in this injustice together. So at that point, she experienced deep and profound grace in her life. What a great form of intercessory prayer. And finally, kind of talks about intercessory prayer as a way of growing our love so that we encompass the whole world. And so when I was talking about the erotic power of prayer a couple of weeks ago, Tuppence, one of our musicians, came up to me and said, well, in the pagan tradition, prayer then is like casting a spell. So it's casting a spell on the world and putting out our positive energy and our positive thoughts out there so that we all could become healthier. And as Richard's meditation said, we could all live at ease and in safety and equanimity and in loving kindness with one another. And so I thought to myself, wow, what if the only goal of intercessory prayer is that? Can you imagine how we could transform our world even in terms of our relationship to our enemy? I think of Anne Lamont's prayer, for example, where she says that every day I pray for George W. Bush. So what must that be like, and how do we change not only ourselves, but the other in this process of prayer? Let me share with you one final quote from Kenneth. He says that what happens in prayer as a consequence is that compassion replaces anger, empathy overcomes resentment, our spiritual pride gives way to humility, and as we pray, we are changed. Prayer is more than the effect upon the one who engages in the practice. Prayer releases an energy that is not present otherwise. And so by just this simple act of praying for one another, we release an energy that would not otherwise be present in our world. We cast a spell on our world. So as we go forth from here, I'd like you to continue to think about what prayer might mean for us as Unitarian Universalists. So if it doesn't mean X, Y, and Z, what would it mean? And I invite you to come back next week because that's exactly what we're going to be talking about. In the meantime, I invite you to share your bucket. If you find yourself with an empty bucket, find someone who has a full bucket with them and say, "Can I share this load with you?" Make me so.